The Senate Judiciary Committee room was already humming with quiet tension when Senator John Kennedy walked in, a thick folder tucked under his arm. The Louisiana Republican moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly why he was here, and who he was about to take down. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Vice President Kamala Harris, invited to testify on controversial new justice reform measures her office had been promoting. Cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking like 100 unblinking eyes. Harris sat poised, her smile calculated, a stack of neatly arranged briefing papers in front of her. She glanced up as Kennedy took his seat, the slightest flicker crossing her face before her political mask returned. The chairman cleared his throat. "Vice President Harris, you may begin with your statement." Harris launched into a polished speech, heavy with political talking points about equity, systemic change, and historic progress. She spoke with the ease of someone used to controlling the room, her voice filling the chamber with rhythmic certainty. But Kennedy wasn't listening for inspiration, he was listening for weak spots. And he heard them. When Harris finished, Kennedy adjusted his microphone, leaned forward, and let a pause hang in the air long enough for everyone to notice. Then, with his trademark Southern drawl, he asked, "Madam Vice President, before we get lost in the poetry, can you tell the American people, under oath, whether your reform plan removes prosecutorial discretion for violent repeat offenders?" The question landed like a hammer. Harris blinked, opened her mouth, then closed it again. The shuffle of papers, the click of cameras, the murmurs from the gallery, it all seemed to grow louder. Kennedy didn't move, his eyes locked on hers, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. The showdown had begun. Kamala Harris straightened in her seat, her practiced smile faltering just enough for the cameras to catch it. "Senator," she began, her tone smooth but a fraction too measured, "our plan is about fairness, equity, and ensuring that justice is applied without bias. We have safeguards." Kennedy cut in, not raising his voice but slicing through her words with precision. "That wasn't my question, Madam Vice President. I didn't ask for your campaign slogan. I asked, does your plan remove prosecutorial discretion for violent repeat offenders? Yes or no?" A ripple of tension moved through the chamber. Staffers on both sides glanced up from their laptops, sensing the shift in the air. Harris's eyes flickered toward her papers, then to her aides seated behind her. Kennedy didn't miss it. "You see," Kennedy continued, leaning in closer, "when the American people hear you talk about equity, they deserve to know if that means dangerous people walk out of jail because a politician decided it would look good on a press release." Harris inhaled, clearly weighing her options. "Senator, I will not engage in fearmongering." "That's not fearmongering," Kennedy fired back, his voice still calm but now razor-sharp. "That's a fact. Either you're keeping violent repeat offenders off the streets, or you're not. Which is it?" The gallery erupted in murmurs again. The chairman banged his gavel for order, but the sound only seemed to amplify the drama. Kennedy sat back slightly, his gaze never breaking from Harris, letting the weight of the unanswered question crush the silence. And in that silence, the trap he'd set so carefully began to snap shut. Kennedy let the silence hang just long enough for Harris to shift uncomfortably in her chair. Then, with deliberate slowness, he opened the thick folder in front of him. Papers slid across the desk with a crisp whisper, the sound echoing in the chamber like a warning. "Madam Vice President," he said, his drawl carrying just enough bite to make the hairs on the back of every neck stand up, "I took the liberty of reading through your justice reform framework, front to back, and I noticed something curious on page 73, paragraph 4. He pulled out a highlighted page, holding it up so the cameras could zoom in. "It says, and I quote, 'Prosecutorial discretion shall be eliminated in cases involving repeat offenders where equity-based sentencing guidelines apply.'" Gasps rippled through the room. Harris's aides shifted nervously. Kennedy didn't let the moment pass. "Now," he continued, "maybe you think that's just a harmless line of legal jargon. But I've got reports from 3 major cities that implemented your pilot program. Guess what happened? Convictions for violent repeat offenders dropped by 27% in 6 months. That's not justice. That's roulette with public safety." Harris leaned forward, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "Senator, you're cherry-picking data." Kennedy pounced. "Cherry-picking? Madam Vice President, this is your own DOJ report. I didn't write it. I didn't even edit it. I just read it, out loud. Are you saying your own numbers are misleading? The gallery went silent again, the kind of silence that crackles with anticipation. Harris hesitated, lips pressed together, and in that pause, Kennedy's eyes gleamed. He knew she had no safe way out. Harris drew in a deep breath, her tone turning defensive but still trying to project authority. Senator, what you fail to acknowledge is the broader vision here. Our reform plan aims to address systemic inequities that have plagued our justice system for generations. By focusing on rehabilitation and community investment. Kennedy leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice cutting through hers like a scalpel. Madam Vice President, with all due respect, you can wrap this in as much political gift paper as you want, but the fact remains, you're making it easier for repeat violent offenders to avoid prosecution. That's not systemic reform. That's reckless. The Vice President's jaw tightened, but Kennedy pressed harder, sensing the shift. Now, you can stand here and give us a TED talk about equity, or you can answer my question. Are you willing to restore prosecutorial discretion so dangerous criminals don't get a free pass? Yes or no? Harris glanced toward the chairman, clearly hoping for intervention, but the gavel stayed still. The camera zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every flicker of discomfort. Because here's the truth, Madam Vice President, Kennedy continued, his tone now almost conversational but laced with steel, the American people are not fooled by word games. They want to know if their kids are safe walking home at night. They want to know if their neighborhoods are protected. And right now, your plan says, maybe not. The crowd behind him erupted in low murmurs, the tension palpable. Harris adjusted her papers, searching for a foothold, but Kennedy's relentless focus left her boxed in. This wasn't just a policy debate anymore, it was a public cross-examination. Kennedy's eyes never left Harris as he reached for another document in his folder, this one in a sealed envelope. He tapped it lightly on the desk before sliding it toward the microphone. Madam Vice President, he said, his tone lowering to something almost solemn, before you give us another speech, I want to read you something. It's from a woman in Chicago named Ellen Porter. Her son was murdered, by a man who had been arrested 3 times for violent assault, but never prosecuted under your pilot reform program. The room froze. Even the faint rustle of reporters' notepads went still. Kennedy unfolded the letter and began to read, his voice steady but heavy with gravity. Senator Kennedy, my son is dead because the man who killed him was released again and again. They told me it was about equity. They told me it was about giving him another chance. But my son never got another chance. His life ended in the street, and all I got was a pamphlet about restorative justice. I want to know, who speaks for my boy? When Kennedy finished, the silence was suffocating. He let the words linger in the air, each one like a weight pressing down on Harris. Now, Madam Vice President, Kennedy said, his voice sharpening again, you can tell this grieving mother her son's death was worth it for your idea of reform. Or you can admit your policy failed her. Which is it? Harris swallowed hard, visibly rattled. Her carefully constructed composure showed its first real cracks. A camera flash caught the exact moment her eyes flickered, panic, however brief, laid bare for millions watching at home. Harris straightened in her chair, her voice sharper now, the friendly veneer gone. Senator, I will not allow you to exploit a tragedy to score political points. The data shows. Kennedy cut her off with a raised hand, his tone suddenly like cold steel. Exploit a tragedy? Madam Vice President, I'm giving that mother a voice in this chamber because your policy took her son's voice away forever. The crowd behind him murmured, a low wave of agreement rolling through the room. Harris pressed on, clearly trying to regain control. These isolated cases do not reflect the overall success of our reforms. We've reduced incarceration rates, we've invested in communities. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, letting out a short, humorless chuckle. Invested in communities? Madam Vice President, your program is investing in revolving doors for violent criminals. You're treating prison like a bad Yelp review, send them out and hope they come back improved. The remark drew a mix of gasps and stifled laughs from the gallery. Harris's lips tightened, her jaw clenching, but Kennedy wasn't finished. "You keep talking about the data," he said, sliding another sheet toward her. "Here's some more. In 3 cities using your plan, violent crime went up by double digits in under a year. That's not my opinion, that's your DOJ's statistics. And yet, you're here defending it like it's a success story." Harris opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy leaned forward again, voice dropping to a deliberate, cutting pace. "Madam Vice President, how many more funerals have to happen before you admit this isn't working?" The tension in the room was now electric. One wrong word from Harris, and the exchange would explode into a viral political firestorm. Harris's patience finally cracked. She leaned forward, her voice rising in frustration. "Senator, you are deliberately distorting the intent of these reforms. We are working to dismantle decades of systemic injustice, and you sit here cherry-picking statistics to scare the public." Kennedy didn't flinch. In fact, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a predator sensing his opponent had just stepped into the open. "Madam Vice President, the public doesn't need me to scare them. The nightly news is doing a fine job of that, thanks to policies like yours." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the sound of shifting bodies and clicking cameras filling the chamber. Harris tried to speak again, but Kennedy raised his hand, not to silence her, but to deliver the blow he'd been holding back. "You talk about dismantling injustice," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "But injustice is a mother burying her son because the system cared more about political slogans than keeping dangerous people off the streets." Harris's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't interrupt. She couldn't. The weight of the statement landed like a hammer, and the room felt smaller, heavier. Kennedy leaned back, letting the silence do the rest. "The truth, Madam Vice President, is that the American people want justice that protects the innocent before it protects the repeat offender. And right now, you can't promise them that." The moment was pure political theater. And Kennedy knew it. The cameras caught Harris's expression, a mixture of defiance and unease, and Kennedy's steady, unblinking gaze. By the time the clip hit the evening news, the headline would write itself. Harris took a measured breath, clearly aware the cameras were capturing every twitch of her expression. She shifted her tone, softening it, as if appealing directly to the viewers at home. "Senator, we can go back and forth all day, but leadership means making hard choices for the greater good. Sometimes that means policies that don't please everyone, but move us toward a fairer system overall." Kennedy nodded slowly, pretending to consider her words. "Hard choices, fairer system, sounds nice on a campaign flyer," he said, leaning forward again. "But let's put it in plain English. Your fairer system means a violent repeat offender can walk free, until the day he hurt someone else. That's not fairness. That's gambling with people's lives." Harris tried to counter, "That's an oversimplification." Kennedy cut in, his voice rising just enough to seize the room's attention. "No, Madam Vice President, that's exactly the point. The law should be simple: if you're dangerous, you don't get to walk the streets. Period. The only people who think that's complicated are the ones who never have to face the consequences." The audience behind him broke into scattered applause before the gavel slammed for order. Harris's composure slipped further, she was blinking more often now, her hands tightening on the papers in front of her. Kennedy then delivered the final twist. "Madam Vice President, I've just submitted a motion to subpoena every internal DOJ memo related to this program. We're going to see, on paper, whether you knew the risks before you pushed it. And if you did, the American people will have their answer." Harris froze for a moment, caught between outrage and calculation. The tension was thick enough to cut, and the camera zoomed in to capture the exact instant she realized she'd been boxed in. Within hours of the hearing's end, Kennedy's subpoena announcement had detonated across every major news outlet. Cable networks ran split screens. On one side, the vice president's frozen reaction, on the other, Kennedy calmly filing the motion with a faint, confident smirk. Conservative commentators hailed it as the moment Harris got cornered, while even some centrist analysts admitted Kennedy's tactical precision had been flawless. On social media, the clip of Kennedy saying, "If you're dangerous, you don't walk the streets," racked up millions of views before midnight. Memes flooded Twitter, some depicting Harris backed into a literal corner, others showing Kennedy dropping a gavel like a mic. The White House communications team scrambled to push back, releasing a carefully worded statement that Harris had stood her ground and defended reforms with integrity. But the narrative was already slipping. Reporters were now chasing DOJ staffers for leaks on the program's internal risk assessments, exactly what Kennedy had predicted. In Louisiana, Kennedy was met at the airport by cheering supporters holding signs that read, "Truth First," and "No Free Pass for Criminals." Local news captured him shaking hands, smiling, and telling voters, this was about protecting families, plain and simple. Meanwhile, Harris faced mounting questions from the press pool. At a morning event in Philadelphia, a reporter shouted, "Madam Vice President, did you know about the crime risk data before you rolled out the policy?" Harris, visibly irritated, brushed it off as political theater, but the clip of her terse response only fueled the perception that Kennedy had struck a nerve. By evening, headlines across the country were locked in. Kennedy's question traps Harris in Senate showdown. Subpoena gamble could expose White House risk calculations. Harris on defense as crime policy faces new scrutiny. The battle had moved beyond the Senate chamber, it was now a public trial, and Kennedy was winning in the court of public opinion. By the next morning, the subpoena story dominated every political talk show. Panels of analysts dissected the hearing frame by frame, some noting how Kennedy had skillfully baited Harris into a defensive posture before delivering the surprise subpoena. Others called it a masterclass in Senate gamesmanship. Polling data released midday sent shockwaves through the Beltway. Kennedy's national favorability had jumped 7 points overnight, while Harris's approval on public safety issues dropped by double digits. Headlines blared, "Kennedy surges after showdown," and "Harris stumbles under crime policy pressure." Behind closed doors, Harris's aides urged her to go on offense, but she resisted, aware that a direct counterattack could keep the story alive even longer. Still, the damage was obvious. Op-eds from both sides of the aisle criticized her inability to deliver a clear, confident defense in the face of Kennedy's questions. Meanwhile, Kennedy leaned into the moment without overplaying it. In interviews, he kept his tone measured, telling reporters, "This isn't about scoring points. It's about making sure the people in charge answer for the consequences of their policies." The line resonated with voters, painting him as a principled watchdog rather than a partisan brawler. Clips of the exchange became a staple of the news cycle, replayed alongside dramatic music in countless viral videos. One montage on YouTube, titled "The Exact Moment Kennedy Cornered Harris," hit 1 million views in less than a day. By week's end, the Senate chamber clash had transformed into a political turning point. Kennedy emerged not just as a skilled interrogator, but as a symbol for those demanding tougher accountability from Washington. Harris, though still defiant in public, now carried the political scar of a confrontation she couldn't control. For Kennedy's supporters, the message was clear: in the arena of high-stakes politics, preparation and precision could still topple even the highest-ranking opponents. And for Harris, every future appearance in the Senate would carry the shadow of that one, viral, unforgettable moment. My friends, what you saw today wasn't about politics, it was about accountability. The American people deserve leaders who will tell them the truth, even when it's inconvenient, and policies that put their safety first. I didn't ask those questions to score headlines. I asked them because families in this country are paying the price for reckless decisions made behind closed doors. When those in power gamble with public safety, they gamble with lives, and that's a bet we can't afford to lose. I'll keep pressing for the answers you deserve, no matter how uncomfortable they may be for the folks in Washington. Because at the end of the day, my loyalty is to you, the hardworking men and women who expect their leaders to protect them, not endanger them. And as long as I have this seat in the Senate, you can count on me to keep asking the tough questions, and demanding the truth.